Warm welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Alexi Lynch and I'm the Business Manager at Ironbark Sustainability. We've got some great presenters today, Paul Brown, Adam Gray, Noel Twyman and Georgia Palmer, and I'll introduce them to you as we move along. Before we get started, just cover off on a few housekeeping issues. We're all very well versed in the world of Zoom at the moment, but just a reminder how GoToWebinar works. It's a little bit different. Only presenters can be heard or seen during the presentation. You're encouraged to ask questions whenever you like into the GoToWebinar question box. Just type them in, try and be as clear as you can who it is that you're asking the question of. If we don't have time today to answer the questions, we'll follow up with a call afterwards with anyone. Afterwards, note also that we are recording this webinar. This is the agenda today. It's great to have so many people attending and interested in procuring LEDs. Ultimately, detailed templated LED specs are a little bit pointless and can be boiled down to a page of key requirements that councils can use to choose generally a limited number of approved products from distribution businesses, depending on the owner of the assets. At least that's how it works in the real world. And we're going to hear from some special guests who have been through this process today and share how they've navigated and found what's worked and what hasn't, and also talk to someone from a distribution business to give it from their point of view in Noel. We've got examples from around the country too in this first webinar and also in the next couple that are coming up next week and the week after. I'd like to first acknowledge the First Nations people throughout the state and the country. Where I'm speaking from here is the traditional lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge them as traditional owners, pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also the elders from other communities. Welcome. This is us. Most of you know Ironbark. I hope we've got about 35, 6 staff, depending on where you draw the line around Australia. This is the Victorian office. We work with local governments. We work for local governments, only local governments, on energy efficiency, climate programs all around Australia. Today is going to be nice and casual. As I mentioned before, ask questions anytime you like. Feel free to also just add comments in the question box if you think that your experience has been different or you don't agree with what we're saying. We are totally fine with that and to be as transparent as possible. And we are recording. This is you. Here are the organisations that are here today. We had 63 registrations from I think 46 or 47 organisations in the end. Don't have to worry about furiously taking notes of these things if that is your interest, because you can get the slides at the end. We'll send the slide deck after you send a survey to let us know what you think. We've got a majority of people from New South Wales and Vic. Quite a few Queenslanders here as well today though, which is great, and a smattering from other states. We also asked in advance whether you've been involved in LED procurement for council projects in the past, and pretty much everyone has. A few people have not, or have a council that have been involved but perhaps not themselves. And here are the questions that you asked. So we always try and again keep this as open as possible so that everyone has an understanding of the sort of questions and comments I guess that people are asking. A lot of these we've used to inform and to sort of push the way we discuss today. Some of them we might not get into because they're a little bit more detailed, like specific advice on semi-cut-off versus zero screen, which is possibly something we won't get to, and you can always take offline and call us anytime. But we've tried to match as much of this as possible to the questions that you've got. This particular discussion becomes a little bit more interesting today because 1.8 billion was announced by the feds a couple of months ago through 2 grant programs, the financial assistance grants and the infrastructure, local roads and community infrastructure program. We did hold a recent webinar on this that you can look at your leisure, but what I will just quickly mention is that one of these buckets of money is spent and has just been moved forward, and the other one is new. I would encourage you to check out realaction.com.au on our website, and you can have a look at, especially this bucket, the LRCI amount for councils. Everyone's eligible. It's got to be spent this financial year. It's all for additional work. So if you haven't got LED projects earmarked, lighting is specifically mentioned within the guidelines. It's interesting the way that the money is allocated as well, calculations based on population and road length as per kind of the Roads to Recovery and the Financial Assistance Grant. So it's heavily weighted to road length. You'll see there that Winton Shire, the tiny population of 1,600 people, gets $1 million, whereas Adelaide, with a population of 25,000, gets only 340 grand. So in general, funding will possibly benefit regional and rural areas more than urban, but this is a great opportunity, and we would hope that councils are well and truly looking into it. We're going to start in Tasmania. In 2015, we had a situation in Tassie where there were no bulk changeovers that occurred, and there were no approved LEDs. We were invited by Launceston City Council to come and have a chat about how you would undertake a bulk changeover. Council were a little bit frustrated with what was happening with Tas Networks. This is a time when LEDs were being installed everywhere, especially through the bulk procurement process that the Municipal Association of Victoria had set up. But Launceston and other councils were finding that there were quite a few brick walls put in their way, so they invited us to come and have a chat, and we started working with them, with other Tassie councils and stakeholders, including the Local Government Association of Tasmania, which brings us to our first very special guest today, Georgia Palmer from the Local Government Association of Tasmania. Georgia, welcome.
Thank you.
Georgia, I've got a few questions for you. Firstly, tell us about the state of play in Tasmania in regards to LED installations now. How's it going?
Yeah, sure. So like you mentioned, Ironbark were involved in a project with a group of 6 councils in the north, starting probably back in 2015-16. That was actually the second LED project run out of Tasmania, which was led by councils. The first one was a combined effort with Glenorchy City Council and Hobart. That was well before my time, so I'm not even sure how that project rolled out. But obviously the Northern Lights project, and now we're into our third project with Southern councils, and 5 councils are, I think, even this week finishing a rollout of an LED rollout in residential streets in southern Tasmania. So there've been 3 bulk replacement programs rolled out in Tassie, and each of those projects have been rolled out slightly differently. We have one distribution company, Tas Networks, but as things have evolved over time, the projects and the way they've been rolled out has changed quite significantly. We now are in a situation where we probably have 2/3 of residential street lights now LED, thanks to Tasmanian councils who funded that. And I think we're in quite a unique situation in Tassie where councils get the ownership of the lights after they've paid for the changeover, and therefore they go on to a different tariff, which has shown up a really good business case for councils to invest in these projects in Tassie. Tas Networks, like probably other distribution businesses around the country, are now replacing, as part of their general maintenance program, the older technology with LED, where councils haven't been involved in these projects. So we're seeing a transfer of all assets across to LEDs, but councils aren't seeing the same savings if they haven't invested in the projects themselves.
That is pretty remarkable, and quite a remarkable change in only 4 or 5 years. And Paul might be able to touch on that Hobart and Glenorchy project as well when he jumps on.
Yeah.
So this webinar, we're talking about procurement of LEDs. So how does a council in Tassie purchase LEDs to install? So if you're one of the third of councils that hasn't done it yet, do you just go to the market, bring a spec to Tas Network? What happens?
I actually think if you're one of the councils that hasn't done it now, you really need to get involved in a project. You can't do it as an individual, because most of the councils that haven't been involved are quite small, and therefore it'd be quite an expensive process for them to do a project alone. So they absolutely would need to go through another round of a project like we've seen with the other 3 rollouts. And with the third rollout, the Southern Lights project, that was completely managed outside of Tas Networks. There was, Ironbark were engaged to do the project management, and then we procured the lights through the MAV panel, MAV and LGAT panel, and we also went into contracts with installers. So yeah, a council probably in Tassie wouldn't be able to go it alone and and do a rollover project.
So how would you rate the success or otherwise the good parts and the problematic parts of that sort of panel that you guys have set up that you're talking about?
Oh, look, I think it's worked really well for the third project, the Southern Lights project. The second, the Northern Lights project, Tas Networks did all that procurement. They did the project management. They managed the installation. So councils didn't even have the option to go to a third party to do that. But with the Southern Lights project, we were able to do that. And I think by having the MAV panel and using the MAV LGAT panel, it certainly saved them a lot of time and a lot of money to be able to procure. And the lighting companies and the installers were accredited, well, there were a number of them accredited by Tas Networks. So councils did have a choice about which suppliers to go with. So I think it's worked well. And if another project was going to occur, I would hope that they'd use that process again.
Very interesting. We'll touch on, I think, how it works in other jurisdictions as well, the contestability, if you like, or the way it's changed that you've mentioned there in Tassie at first when there wasn't much choice and then it changed. It is very different in different municipalities. Final question, and I appreciate that you've come on and have to got a very busy schedule today. If you could rewind a couple of years though, would you do anything differently? What would you do differently?
Yeah, I guess the Southern Lights project, we did hit a number of hurdles along the way. I think it would have been great to have a lead council in that project. The 5 councils that participated, there wasn't really a standout lead council that put their hand up saying, we want to run this project, who else wants to come on board? It was more, we went out to the region and said, we've done this Northern Lights project, it's worked well, who wants to come on board? I think in hindsight, it would have been good for one of those councils to put their hand up and be the lead for the project, because I think it would have been a bit smoother, decisions would have been made a bit faster from the council side of things. We also hit a number of hurdles with the distribution business. They changed their parameters significantly from the Northern Lights project, and we didn't expect that. I don't know how we could have dealt with that differently. It was just a significant change in their internal processes, the way they costed the project and things like that. So that was one of the other big significant hurdles. The better a relationship you probably have with the distribution business, the smoother it might be, and I think it would obviously differ from distribution business to distribution business. But in Tassie, we only have one, and we have no choice. So that was a bit of a hurdle with the Southern Lights project, and so the project took a long time to sort of get off the ground and then get implemented, longer than we would have hoped for. So we probably would have also built in a bit more around once the project was finished, how we are going to deal with failed lights, how we are going to deal with warranties, because councils own the lights. Those sort of factors weren't really built into the project at the outset, and now we're identifying we have to deal with those issues now, and it would have been good if we were able to build that somehow into the original contracts maybe. They're really some of the things that I've reflected on in relation to the projects I've been involved in.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Georgia. I think you'll find there are some similarities as we move on, and we will be talking to a DNSP next to get their side of things. The challenges that you mentioned are quite standard across Australia. And even though you only have the one distribution business within the state, it is generally no different for Glenorchy or Break a Day in Tasmania, in Tas Networks, as it would be with, you know, a Darebin in AusNet or a Parramatta in Endeavour. They've still only got the one distribution business that they work in. So very interesting. Thank you so much for your time. We'll let you get to your other meetings and move on and chat to you later.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Georgia, as we move on to procurement for large-scale street lighting projects. So assets in Australia are largely owned by distribution businesses. In the vast majority of cases, they're also charged with approving the types of products that can be used. So we're working at the moment with a couple of Queensland councils, and one of the items on the list is enabling councils to utilise the latest products. Again, in Queensland, 2 DNSPs. They own and operate, and similar to Tasmania, we've been asked by a few councils in Queensland to try and help deliver projects. This is essentially how it works. There are 15 DNSPs in the country, all generally have approval authority, and this is pretty critical when you're thinking about specifications for projects or for lights, because if it's not on the approved list, it's not going to go up. You need to be across this sort of stuff. It's the projects that often count, not just the products, that will help understand the process of procurement. So how do they work? We're going to ask Noel Twyman from Citipower Powercor. Now, bear with me because Noel doesn't have the same special privileges that everyone else seems to have, but I've just unmuted you, Noel. Are you there?
Yes, I can hear you okay.
Oh, wow, you sound very clear. Thank you for joining us. Noel, you've been at Citipower Powercor for quite a long time. You were the distribution business, the first in Australia to approve a standard LED way back in about 2013 when you were there. I understand that Citipower Powercor has pretty much the highest LED penetration in Australia. How does the DNSP approve a light?
Good point. It's I suppose. Do you want me to go start off, or there's probably
how do you do it?
Yeah, sure. I suppose we're often guided by councils and manufacturers that are the bang on our doors, which I'm sure they do to many of the councils as well, showing us their new wares. And I suppose we try and support. Part of the Public Lighting Code in Victoria is to be innovative, to introduce new lights as they become available. Essentially, try to be as cost effective and energy efficient as we possibly can.
Thank you.
So and there's 2 types of lights. Sorry, there's what we call a standard light, or a light that we would stock and replenish and maintain ourselves, and then there's non-standard or decorative lights, which many of the councils would be familiar with, which Citipower Powercor would not stock. We would not, but we do maintain and we do operate on behalf of councils. So in our Public Lighting Code, it talks about how the responsibility for the procurement of those decorative lights is the councils or the road manager, but both standard and non-standard need to go through an approval process to be connected to our networks.
Thank you. Just a reminder for everyone too, you can jump onto the GoToWebinar question box if you've got questions, and hopefully Noel will be able to stick around later. If not, we can pass them on to him at a different stage. So Noel, I'm from a council. I come and knock on your door and I say, I've got 4,000 standard 80-watt mercury vapors on residential roads and I want to change them to LEDs. I've developed this really cool detailed specification to go to the market so we can get exactly what I want. What's the next step for me, Noel?
Pretty easy in some ways. We both know, we're both on the same page in terms of the volume of lights that are out there to be replaced. What we ask councils to do is to register their interest. So we've got a portal where customers can register their projects, and that starts the process. A project manager would be appointed to help you work through the process. There's 2 paths you can go down in terms of, we can do a one-stop shop. We can do the whole lot. We can do the procurement of the lanterns, do all the contract negotiations with our external parties, and we can go up with the lights up in the air. The other option is where the council embarks on what they call a managed tender, where we work with our approved contractors to get the best price, and we work with the councils to select that tenderer. There may be many reasons. Cost may not be the only driving factor. There may be local content, or there may be other drivers. And the other part is the procurement of the material is what we call contestable in Citipower and Powercor. So we enable the councils to go out and procure those lanterns through their own procurement process. But always a but, they need to be from a list of approved lanterns that are on our list of approved. Yeah, that's on our list that's available to those councils.
Gotcha. So there's a set approved list. My specifications might work for the installer, but the installer needs to be approved to work on your network, and same, the specifications that I bring for my materials, it actually still needs to be a light that you've approved.
That's correct, and we're happy to work. We work with a number of councils to try and adopt new technology. So we've just recently approved, I think we're now down to 13.7 watts for a category P light, which is quite astounding. And we've recently approved that light, and so that has enabled a number of councils to move the next step. We started it way back when at 29 watts, and we've progressively been. That's I suppose the ongoing challenge for us as distributors is to keep up with the wattage changes. Manufacturers and are continually reducing that wattage, but we want to continually make sure that it's still a compliant light. It still meets our technical needs. It also still meets the Australian standard requirements as well.
Great. Final question, Noel. In this next webinar, we're going to have a stronger focus on smart controls next week. But while we're lucky enough to have you here, how many councils in Citipower, Powercor are installing smart controls at the moment?
It's interesting. We've three of the three large councils are probably predominantly where most of our smart P cells have been installed. That's over 15,000 have been installed. Citipower, Powercor is also, I suppose we see the future in it, and so we've actually installed it in over 22 other municipalities across Citipower and Powercor. So very small numbers, but certainly at isolated intersections, we see a real benefit for us and for the community if we can be aware that a single light at a single intersection is not working, without relying on the community to tell us. We can be a bit more proactive and get out there and fix it early, which is a good thing for the community and for us.
Awesome. Many thanks, Noel. Appreciate your time. If you can stick on the line, great. If you can't, then we understand. If people have questions, please keep bringing them through, and we'll chat to you soon. Cool. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'll hang around and give me a yell if you need me. Cheers. I appreciate it. Thanks, Noel. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Paul Brown. Paul, I'm going to make you presenter. And you now have control of the world. Everyone else, please jump on and ask your Q&As if you like. And we've got Adam Gray standing by as well to talk in 15, 20 minutes.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Lex. So you'll notice, although we're talking about procuring LEDs, we're talking a lot about projects and how you get good projects up and how projects work. The reason we're talking about it like this is that if you are delivering street lighting projects, you really need to understand how the project is delivered in your region. So how the project's delivered in Tasmania is different to the way it's delivered in Citipower, Powercor, and different to the way it's delivered in Ergon. So we'll be spending quite a bit of time on how do you work through intrangible processes with distributors, which areas these processes are largely already worked out, and then we'll spend a little bit of time on procurement. We will also go in and talk about council-owned assets, so off-street lighting in your car parks, sports grounds, pathways, all that sort of stuff. But before we do that, we're going to keep talking about LED street lighting projects. Okay, so as many of you will know, in terms of delivering projects, we have talked about a process, a fairly standard asset management process for delivering these bulk upgrades. We have a 5-step process, but this is a pretty typical project delivery approach. And the majority of what we will be talking about today is actually step 1, which is the preparation stage. And this is all about how do you get the numbers to stack up? How do you make sure that your relationship with the distributor allows for and enables easy projects? If that prepare step is done well, then the projects roll really simply and really easily. In Citipower Powercor, there's probably been 40, 50 of these projects, so they're very easy to deliver. In Tasmania, there's only been 3, and obviously it's still been challenging at the 3rd project. Once you get to about 5 to 10, then the projects start moving quite smoothly.
Okay, so how do you know when you have a project that is shovel ready to deliver? This slide here shows you 2 different graphs of outcomes from council projects to replace LED streetlights in 2015, the blue polygon, and 2020, the green polygon. Firstly, before we dig into the variances between these, the starting point of each of these is either 2015 or 2020, and there is an upfront cost there for council, hence a negative amount at the start for most scenarios. And then 20 years later, either 2035 or 2040, there are either project savings or, in the 2015 example, no savings from the projects. So what was the main reason for this variance? Well, the main drivers of business case are project costs and maintenance pricing. And so the difference, what happened between 2015 and 2020 was that the project costs were benchmarked and reduced, and the maintenance prices for Endeavour flipped such that the LED maintenance prices were lower in 2020 than the standard lights, whilst in 2015 it was the other way around. We will talk about this a lot more later on in the presentation. However, just to put into perspective, this process where we've transitioned from a poor business case to a good business case has occurred in all of New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and South Australia. There is a number of other jurisdictions where this process is underway or there's further work required. So, for example, in the Energex region of Queensland, the business case is actually very good currently, but there aren't many or any large-scale LED projects that have been delivered. While in the Ergon region, the business case is poor, but there are moves afoot to do this benchmarking work. So in Queensland, we expect a transition to occur where a lot more councils will be delivering projects, whilst in Western Power, a lot of this initial work still has to be done about how is the project delivered, what are the project costs, looking to try and reduce overall maintenance prices, etc.
All right. What about council procurement requirements? We're talking about multi-million-dollar projects. One project we're currently working on is about a $15 to $20 million project. Others could be as low as $200,000 to $300,000, but the average is probably around $1.5 to $3 million project. Councils have both internal requirements around purchasing as well as statutory requirements. And they need to be very careful about how they deliver these projects. In Victoria, for example, Noel just mentioned that they provide 2 options, one where Powercor manages the whole process and the other where the council is part of the decision-making process and in fact procures the LED lights direct from the manufacturer. in Victoria, the councils are required to get ministerial approval for any projects that does not meet the Local Government Act, including these. And what the minister says is, that's fine, but you need to be involved in the procurement process. So in effect, for any councils that trigger higher procurement requirements in that state, they will be required to take up the second option, not the first. Obviously, each council also has their own internal requirements and caps on how much they can procure without a public tender. Ultimately, each state is different. But our attitude to this is ultimately the purpose of the regulatory requirements and the clauses is to make sure that councils are getting a fair and reasonable price. And how do we go about identifying that? We do a lot of benchmarking. Lex mentioned earlier Ergon and Energex. A lot of the work we're doing currently is benchmarking project costs, benchmarking maintenance prices. Let's talk a little bit further about how that works in practice. So, when thinking about benchmarking, we're really trying to understand, does the project make sense? So we essentially look at the project and we compare it against all other projects in the country, whether they've been contestable, fully contestable. So some projects are up to 95% fully contestable for councils, through to projects where there is no contestability at all. Our approach to this is really understanding, do the numbers make sense? We're essentially buying and utilising the same products around the country, and the labour costs are more or less similar, and there's often the same contractors in different states or different regions delivering the projects. So we look at the project itself. We also ask questions like, can the councils purchase the materials directly themselves, or the labour, or the project management? Now, when I say ask, the key thing around this is that it is the distributor who determines the level of contestability. So they consider, what the regulations in their state require of them, and then they'll identify whether councils can go to the market for any of these elements. Ultimately, we don't really care as long as the projects are fair and reasonable and councils are getting a competitive price. There is obviously, legal and procurement benefits in contestability, but ultimately, as long as we can benchmark and check against other regions, then that is appropriate. We talked about maintenance earlier. So all of these things I've talked about to date are all about the project cost, but maintenance is one of the key drivers of the business case. It is much harder to negotiate or change maintenance pricing than it is to change project costs. There is a process in most jurisdictions where the maintenance pricing is considered by the Australian Energy Regulator every 5 years. And we certainly work with councils and distributors all the time on maintenance pricing. However, that's a very slow process. So if you can resolve your issues by addressing the project cost, that is always a quicker way to address a bad business case compared to maintenance pricing. Maintenance pricing is a long game. It's definitely worth doing, but it does take a while. So all of these regions have gone through this process, and it takes years and it takes many projects to get to a point where both the councils and the distributors and the lighting manufacturers are all comfortable with how the process works and understand it, and the pricing is fair and reasonable. For regions where this hasn't been done yet, then it's a well-worn path, but it does take probably 12 to 24 months or thereabouts. All right.
Hey, Paul, before you jump on to our last guest and special second opinion, I'm going to ask you some really quick questions, if you can give us 20-second answers. How's that?
I will attempt to.
You'll attempt. Firstly, the benchmarking. George has asked, will you publish the benchmarking or do we need to engage you for access to that information?
We definitely don't publish it. A lot of it is commercial in confidence, and we certainly wouldn't be spreading that around. We provide it to the councils and to distributors from time to time in a confidential way without nominating or naming anyone. So we need to be very careful about obviously providing any information about project costs.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you would have to speak.
We wouldn't just provide it to anyone who paid us either. Doesn't work like that.
Gotcha. And so you do need information is redacted when it's sent through. So just give us a buzz. Is Energex Ergon taking into account the new tariffs effective July 2020, e.g. NPL 4? Sorry, taking into account the new tariffs.
Yeah, so we've recently done some analysis on those new tariffs. And in Energex, for example, the payback period is between 3 and 8 years, which is an excellent payback. And that just depends on which route council goes down in terms of that funding. In the Energex region, the business case is clear and strong. In Ergon, we are working with Mackay and Cairns councils, and it is really the project costs which are the challenge, not necessarily the maintenance pricing. Maintenance pricing, there is that differential where LEDs are cheaper than old technology, which means to some extent that hurdles overcome.
Great. Thanks, Paul. I'll head back to you and welcome Adam.
Yes, so we now have our fourth guest running out of numbers. Adam Gray has been working with the Local Government Association of South Australia with councils, employed by them, and also as a consultant to councils around the country around street lighting issues. So we want to ask Adam a number of questions. Adam, are you there? Are you unmuted?
Yeah, hi Paul, how you going?
I'm good, Adam. Welcome. I have a few questions just to fire straight at you. Can you talk a little bit about where LED lighting is in South Australia now, and perhaps just reflect on some of the things you've heard so far, whether they resonate or you have had different experiences?
Yeah, okay. So at the moment, we've concluded several large for South Australia bulk LED replacement projects over the last, I think we started in 2016, 2017, so the last 3 or so years. There's been about 85,000 lights that have now been changed over, so we're well over sort of halfway, particularly for the P category street lights, the ones that councils have got a majority responsible for. And the remaining residential street lights that sit within no more than probably 6 of our metro councils are probably scheduled for changeover in the next 18 to 24 months. Those councils are going through different processes internally to get themselves to that point. So that's where we are. So we've got just to expand a little bit on what Georgia had said. We started in about 2015-16 with negotiations with SA Power Networks that resulted in some different tariff options. So significantly, we had a tariff option that meant that South Australian councils could pay the upfront capital for the luminaire cost and retain title to that luminaire. So even though they are installed on SAPN, so our single distributor in South Australia, SA Power Networks, the luminaires are installed on DNSP owned infrastructure, and thus we don't have access to be able to touch essentially the luminaire. We could fund the upfront capital, and that would then influence the ongoing tariff arrangement. So we would be responsible for cost of luminaire after warranty periods, so 10 years for the luminaire we're using in South Australia, and hence the tariff would be less. So the business case was different to the alternative, which was around Sapan funding the entire changeover. So your point regarding different project management for different regions is absolutely spot on. So we started in South Australia with the DNSP, and all due respect to SA Power Networks, they've shown great willingness to progress LED changeover and working with councils, but they were starting from an incredibly low basis of understanding of project management and asset management. So we in South Australia have really struggled with data. So what lights are where, which tariffs are they on, who owns the assets, etc., etc. Even though Sapan owns the bulk of them, there were still questions around where councils owned luminaires and columns and where Sapan did. Our data was terrible. So we've been going through a process of cleansing over the last 3 or 4 years, and Sapan themselves hadn't really done a bulk changeover. So their project management was on a really, really steep learning curve. So, and I can go into a bit more detail, but yeah, your point being regions will have very different project management needs and wants is spot on.
In terms of the procurement process, so was there any conflict around delivering these projects compared to either internal council procurement policies or state regulations? And also in terms of what councils could choose from a product perspective, what were the limitations for them?
Yeah, I'll start with the product. So essentially where we landed with SA Power Networks was, and this was informally decided by SA Power Networks, was they would do a procurement process to determine the most appropriate, cost-effective, manufactured, they were comfortable with, the quality of the materials, etc. They just essentially decided on one P category luminaire for bulk LED replacements, being the Sylvania street LED. So we didn't really have a choice because they were being installed on SA Power Networks infrastructure, and hence they could essentially dictate which luminaires were approved. And at that point in time, they were, so when we had initially started negotiations with them around having the opportunity, the sector hadn't started to discuss technology options, and Sapan essentially took that out of our hands and went and did it. The argument that they put to us is, essentially they are negotiating bulk arrangements with one manufacturer, so we get the benefit of the distributor doing that. The downside is we didn't really have a choice around technology options and power consumption and the like. The way it's all fallen out is we've probably landed on a pretty good product. The street LED has actually proven to cover a lot of the ticks for local government, being cost effective, good quality product. So, so procurement wise, so state regulations don't tend to cause us too much problems in South Australia with our procurement processes, although we do need to maintain diligence around procurement policies that reside within councils and our governance and procurement teams that help navigate this. So because of the unique nature of the projects being dictated to by the distribution business, we have limited rights of access, there's only one technology approved, etc., etc. The way the procurement process worked was we engaged with a number of different procurement specialists within local government and had advice around formulating essentially what would be an exemption application through council, so that we could go directly to SA Power Networks to procure, or undertake a select tender for the one luminaire, noting that the select tender was limited to either directly through SA Power Networks, directly through Enervin, which is a subsidiary of SA Power Networks, or to the manufacturer directly. So we only have those three options. So no problems with procurement, but it was fairly limited and required some exemption exemption processes through council.
Okay, awesome. I have one last question. Try and take your mind back to 2014. Port Adelaide were just about to lose the preliminary final to Hawthorn. You're working with a bunch of councils, talking to SAPN, thinking of a way forward. Is there anything that you would do differently, knowing what you know now?
You know, SA Power Networks had a slide that they were putting up at the time, which was essentially, I think it was learning to fly as we build the plane. When I look back at that slide, I don't think there was any more accurate reflection of what we were actually doing. So we had a leadership group of 3 fairly sizable councils with good leadership within those councils, engaged directly with the distributor and the right people in the distribution business. So some people at the right level of the business that were had a passion to drive this forward. And we had some good consultancies, you know, involved as well to provide some advice. So when I look back at it, I think, well, what would we have done differently then? Probably not a hell of a lot, you know, because you know, generally we weren't leveraging a lot from interstate. Maybe we could have done better at looking at projects that were delivered and some of the challenges that were experienced, but because of the regional nature and the nature of having to work within SA Power Networks' structure, there's only so much you can bring over. Some of the key challenges that we've hit during projects have been around data and asset management. So, you know, you could go back and say, right, councils probably should have started cleaning up their GIS data around what assets they've got in their individual councils, not only what SAPN infrastructure and assets, but also their own assets and infrastructure. So where council own lights or they've got on tariffs that are just being maintained by SAPN. So that data challenge was really significant early on. So really hard to manage what you don't know. And I think that's a bit of a key.
That's actually a perfect segue, Adam, into the next segment. So I might just jump you off. We'll hopefully have chances for questions towards the end, but thanks for your time. That's very valuable.
No worries. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, listeners.
Okay, council-owned assets. So I'm going to skip through this a bit more quickly than I was planning to, but we'll be talking a lot about this in webinar 3. We will talk about council strategies and policies. So council-owned assets, car parks, pathways, sporting grounds, etc., are a bit like picking up 5-cent pieces. There are a lot of energy efficiency opportunities there, but they are disparate. There's not tens of thousands of streetlights. There's probably around 10% of the lighting than what you have in a street or in other areas for councils. The approach that councils need to take when considering these assets is really around an asset management system. We recently did some analysis for one metro council, and they identified around about a $27 million liability of their owned assets. And that's over around about a 20-year period. It's manageable in a year, but not if they all start falling apart over a 3 to 5 year period. So understanding the assets is critical. Some things to think about are around the lighting assets themselves. Just like what Adam said, you need to know what you've got. There needs to be a clear policy strategy, and then consider projects to deliver and reduce cost. So this is much more of like building a building than it is writing a generic specification or tender and going to the market. It's really understanding what it is you've got and what it is that you want to deliver. And then have an ongoing process, asset management process to review. The second area where councils have a lot of assets, and this obviously depends on where you are, growth area councils may have a lot of decorative street lighting. Often they can be owned, or there's certainly higher capital costs and liabilities for councils for these types of assets. Same thing applies, know what you have. And then secondly, from a business case perspective, there are a really wide range of potential options. Anything from changing a lamp to changing the whole pole to a standard light. And so that liability question really comes home for some of the larger growth area councils. One thing I can't overemphasize is design. So councils are the responsible authority when it comes to lighting levels, both in streets and in council-owned assets. So spending a lot of time and thinking and consideration on design is key. Which brings us round to specifications and standards. Should you be looking at distributor, construction manuals, Australian standards, different LED specifications? Well, what we would recommend is that you think about what it is that you're delivering. What is the project? What is the design that you want to achieve? That is a critical thing that councils need to think of. From a product perspective, in your own, if you own it, you need to think about it. If it is the distributor who owns it, you're obviously limited to what they will provide to you. And when it comes to specifications, all councils, especially for their own operations, but also for lighting design levels within streets, should be developing their own guidelines or policies around lighting. And we will be talking a lot more about that in webinar 3, as mentioned. Back to Tasmania, where we started. So what happened? What did we find? Well, since 2015, there's been a lot of mayors shaking hands with people in hard hats, which is always a positive. Around 95% of the project that have been delivered recently have been contestable. The distributor has added a whole bunch of new approved products to their list. The project costs have been reduced by around about 30% since 2015, all through negotiation. There has also been statewide LED maintenance price reductions, which was sort of a parallel process and project. And there's been around about 17,000 lights installed with greenhouse savings of 8,000 tonnes and overall savings of about $37 million. So obviously these projects, if they make sense, if you can get all the ducks in a row and have a good relationship with your distributor, will make a lot of savings for council and community. Lex, I think it's back over to you for Q&A, but I think I've used up all of the time.
Oh, that's okay. We got a bit more time to speak to others, which is good, I think. So it's not just us speaking, and that was pretty illuminating, especially the stuff that, Adam, Georgia, and Noel were saying. We will wrap up, but we might stay on the line if just for questions. Before we do, though, Adam does just want to jump in and give another 15, 16-second thing about developers. Adam, are you there? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yep, all good.
Yeah, okay. Look, just a slide that Paul put up that just made me want to raise a point. When working in councils on these bulk LED projects, what I would see would be applications come in for designs for either developers or new subdivisions where new lighting was being put in. All I can say for those councils that are online, absolutely get on top of what developers are installing and start to dictate the infrastructure that you want in place rather than what they want in place, because essentially they'll hand it over and it'll be your responsibility. And one of the biggest headaches I had working in several councils across South Australia was dealing with the 5,000 different varieties of luminaires and the quality and condition of those in various forms, because we had lots of failures in some and some proved quite well. But from an asset management perspective, some of the key tasks I had was reducing the scale of different types of technology that we had across cities to bring them back to maybe half a dozen, 7 different types for purpose. So just a caution to everyone that is working in local government, get on top of what new assets are being put in there and start to take control of that.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. And you've given us another really good segue, actually, because we will focus on this a lot more with 3 or 4 real-life examples on policies and guidelines to make sure it's clear and you don't get screwed over when that happens. Look, that's kind of it for now. And there's another point there. Scott from Breezy just made the point. Totally agree with the emphasis on design too. So thanks for that. You'll see we do have 2 more webinars coming up, and we are also seeking a bit of feedback on this one. But although we will officially say farewell, we will ask that if people did want to stick on the line, because we do have 2 or 3 questions that are just coming through now, we will keep this line open. So if you need to go, we understand. And thank you very much for coming along. We hope you see the next one. And if you click on that feedback form there, it'll take all of 64 seconds of your life and you'll get the slides. Everyone else, stick around and we'll go through some more of these questions if that's okay. And I think Adam and Noel are still there as well. So we'll carry on. Okay, Noel, if you are still there, I've got a question from Karen saying, thanks for your DNSP insights. With the smart lighting that you mentioned, is the technology being used for trimming and dimming? If so, what have the outcomes been? Or is the smart lighting just being used for identifying lights that are not working? Now, I'm going to find you on my list here and unmute you. Noel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Trimming and dimming. Dimming is certainly being done more, and certainly the direction of the council, and it's been used for glare spill, to reduce the light intensity due to customer complaints. But that's been done in conjunction with the council. In terms of trimming, so one of the requirements to do trimming is you would need to have what they call a CMS, customer management system, to manage the lights in that level of, so by putting schedules on lights or reducing the output of a light, it's far more easier to do with a CMS. So we don't currently have one of those in Citipower Powercor. We're going through the throes of working out how we're going to fund it, and that's quite a difficult issue for us, because we effectively can only charge what we're obligated to do under the regulation. So a CMS isn't part of that regulation. So how do we recover our costs to expend it? So that's one of the challenges going forward.
Great, thank you. And while you're here,
can I briefly add to that?
Sure.
So Victoria is currently going through a price review process with the AER. I mentioned before that happens once every 5 years. The councils actually very recently came out and stated to the AER that they want the distributors to spend money on this item, which is usually a very unusual thing. Typically, councils are saying, please don't spend money so that our maintenance prices are lower. But the councils in that state have essentially asked the distributors to increase some of their capital costs in order to enable that CMS to get up. And the other thing, just to add to that, is that we've been doing a bunch of designs for different council areas, looking at trimming and dimming and some other functions. And we're finding savings of around about 30 to 40% on top of just the LED changeover. So it's looking very positive in terms of increased control and energy savings.
Awesome, thanks, Paul. That would be an interesting one to touch on next week. Sorry, go Noel.
I was just going to add, one of the opportunities of a CMS though is also the operability can extend from not just the distributor but also to the customer. So the council could, depending on negotiations with the DNSP, that responsibility could be passed through and be able to be managed by the council potentially. That certainly hasn't been worked through yet, but that's one of the opportunities that we're moving into is the trimming and dimming may be something that could be passed through, which would be a great opportunity.
yes, there's a related question to that coming through, and thanks for everyone staying on the line. Pretty much everyone is still here, which is a great sign. We'll touch on some of these next week, specifically around the procuring of smart controls. But just on that one, Indy's asked or made the point noting that our design was at least 50% reduction, but we can't get the financial savings as yet. Paul, what's the update from our good friend David Ripper and the projects you've been involved in?
Well, we will talk about this more next week, but it is moving apace. We expect this to be overcome within the next 12 months so that councils can get the billing savings, even though the energy savings are there because they're unmetered assets currently. You can't get them transferred through to the bills, but we expect that to change. And in fact, have meetings with a number of distributors over the next week or two to start getting that cracking.
Fantastic. All right, we'll have a hard stop in about 5 or 6 minutes, but these questions still come. So another point, I guess, that Scott's raised with the developer stuff, and getting back to your point, Adam, delivered products that the warranties are transferable, absolutely. And I know Adam was heavily involved with all of that in South Australia, even when it came to the transferring of warranties between distribution businesses and councils, where they have the tariff that has what's called beneficial ownership in SA. So really critical to include, and probably really critical to include in your guidelines and strategies. Another question, I guess, around the, this is from Kevin, the question for Noel. I think you have touched on already with your smart lighting solution. Does it include metering?
So in answer to that, the smart cells have the ability to meter. We're certainly we're recording energy usage of those luminaires. The challenge is the metrology requirement, and as Paul touched on, that's unless it's on an unmetered load and a smart cell is not a metering device, so it can't be used for that purpose currently with the current regulations.
Thanks for that, Noel. We will again get into that, and our recommendation for councils at the moment is certainly, and Paul has talked about the sort of benefits, a lot higher than expected, in inverted commas, based on the changes to the metrology or whatever it is procedures. You can also essentially discount, any business case that you've got. So if you're feeling lucky, then maybe discount the first couple of years of savings. If you're really ultra conservative, then lag it out a bit longer. But there are ways around it to understand what the savings would be. Another question here, focus on pedestrian lighting within new AS 1158. How does this affect required footprint for LED luminaires? Clancy, if you want to clarify that, you guys might be able to start with you.
Lex?
Give it a go. Yep.
So the AS 1158 series is the road lighting standard. So that includes a technical specification for the luminaire, as well as essentially lighting design standards. They've been updated, and they are continually updated all the time. The current changes around pedestrian lighting will impact on all luminaires. The key thing is that the way we think about existing projects, so bulk upgrades, for example, is you're comparing what's currently there with an LED replacement. And so the changes will affect all luminaires and all spacings, including the current assets. When developing and delivering new projects, so new estates and things like that, then there will be different spacings that occur. It's not radically changing the actual spacing or the performance. There is significant changing to the language and the way things are discussed. But the performance of the light output, for example, there are some changes, but not massive changes. And again, for existing lighting, we're really comparing that light that's already up there with the new light. And so you have to compare both using the new standard.
Is it a bit of a sort of red herring for most councils to be too concerned about that, Paul?
You definitely need to consider it, but as long as the process considers that, assesses design and makes sure that the light output of the luminaire is appropriate, when the vast majority of distribution approval processes do that. So from a approved lighting perspective, that's the responsibility of the distributor to make sure it's a like-for-like replacement. But then when it comes to projects, each council should be assessing the lighting design as part of that project.
No worries. We'll wrap up with a few quick questions here. I can probably answer some of these myself. These were asked in advance around the latest developments and available incentives. So I guess you're talking financial incentives. New South Wales has their EFCI program, Victoria VEET. There is a fair bit of information online. Otherwise, please feel free to just give us a buzz after this discussion. And also, as mentioned, there is the federal government funding. Jump online if you want. We've got a webinar on that where we talked about all the different options. You need to move quick. If you haven't moved already, it's okay because there still might be further funding that is announced in the coming weeks or months around COVID. Another question quickly, LED end-of-life disposals and selecting lights considering health and safety requirements such as lux levels. Paul, do you want to touch on that one? Give us your quick answer to that.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of health and safety and lux levels, there's been a lot of discussion since the American Medical Association put out some information of linking lighting to cancer and other things. Their recommendations are essentially to have a good light, make sure it's well directed, and to reduce the colour or the amount of blue light that's coming out of that light. So in Australia, we already do all of those things, with the possible exception of the blue light bit. And so the thing to consider with blue lighting, it is a lot more complex than simply making a 3000K luminaire versus a 4000K, for example, and that's the colour spectrum. Actually, a 3000K luminaire has blue light in it as well, and it's only when you assess the colour distribution within individual lights that you can see which one has more blue light. So just a 3000K definition will not necessarily limit the blue light. So it gets a bit more complex, but ultimately the LEDs have a lot less light overall. It's almost half. It's probably around about 60% of the light output of the existing lights, and that is because they're much better designed and they put the light in the right spots. So we're already reducing a lot of the dosage levels. In fact, in Australia, our minimum lighting levels are around 5 times lower than what they are in the US, which is where that report came out from. So good design and good products eliminate a lot of those issues.
Thank you very much, Paul. And the very final question is around information on collective purchasing, and not specific, but wanting to learn about the positives and negatives of the MAV LED procurement panel. I guess all I'll say, I can answer that one quickly, is that it just makes so much sense that you don't have to use the MAV or Legat procurement panel if you don't want to. There's previously, years ago, there used to be a little bit of discussion out there about how it was limiting councils. There's no obligation to use these. So if you want to go and purchase the lights yourself, go for gold. All it does is allows you to have skipped the procurement process and the Local Government Act requirements, because MAV and Legat have essentially done that on your behalf. And it also gives you the cheapest price, because it's buying in bulk and it's pre-approved costs and prices from the lighting suppliers. All it does is have the lights that are already approved by distribution businesses, and you can just jump on and do it. And I know in other states the bulk procurement processes have also been used. Because there's a small amount of approved lights generally in distribution areas, you're all buying a similar sort of thing, if not the same thing. Therefore, you get together and you buy 8,000 instead of 2,000, prices go down. So highly recommend that.
The other thing, Lex, just adding to that.
You really quick? Yep.
In other states, if they wanted that panel, which covers Victoria and Tasmania currently, to be expanded to New South Wales or Queensland or anywhere else, their local government association simply needs to ask MAV in Victoria whether they can expand it to other regions. And then that could be accessible to other regions as well.
It's very damn easy. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. That's been done, and we can speak from experience because that panel's been responsible for probably 63% of all of the LEDs that have been installed. The hard work's already gone into it, and so that's what the local government associations are there for. All right, we will definitely wrap up now. I'm going to put in that jot form thing again. You don't have to put your name and email address into this as well. It's really just there to give us 3 or 4 bits of feedback. I'm going to do it again and again and again. You can all see it in the chat function. Please just jump online. I can see some have already come through, and people have generally appreciated it and said that it's been an open and interesting discussion. So thank you. But because you don't have to put your name in there, if there's something we need to improve, let us know. Say, nah, that was boring. I don't like Paul's voice, or whatever it is. You can say whatever you like. We will hopefully see you next time. Thanks again to Georgia, Adam, and Noel, and Paul. That is it for now. Goodbye.